The Atlanta Story is a podcast highlighting Atlanta's most interesting creators, entrepreneurs, and builders. I'm JC Cadet with Atlanta Ventures and co-producer alongside Jon Birdsong. In today's episode, Jon sits down with Sally Bethea, the founding director and Riverkeeper of Chattahoochee Riverkeeper and author. Born and raised in Atlanta, Sally spent 30 years setting up and leading the nonprofit that protects and preserves the 430 miles of our vital Chattahoochee River, which weaves through the state of Georgia and Atlanta. Topics in today's interview include lessons on how the nonprofit started, stories around Chattahoochee's cleanup and turnaround, the best locations on the Hooch, ways to continue the progress, and much more. We hope you enjoy the show and subscribe to The Atlanta Story.
Sally Bethea, thank you for joining the Atlanta Story podcast, founding Riverkeeper of the Chattahoochee and author. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Jon. I really appreciate it.
1994, you became the founding Riverkeeper of Chattahoochee. Mm-hmm. That's a job you created. Tell us about how that came about.
I did not exactly create it. I was in the right place at the right time, I will say. There had begun in the 80s a waterkeeper, riverkeeper movement around the country, starting on the Hudson River in New York. And Ted Turner's daughter, Laura, and her husband, Rutherford Seidel, knew about this program, thought it was a great way of tackling river issues, river pollution issues. And they decided we need a riverkeeper for the Chattahoochee.
Wow.
I was working for another environmental organization and looking to get my teeth into something a little more aggressive, a little more results oriented. And so I was in the right place, and they decided, Ted's foundation decided to give us 30 years ago next month, $50,000 to start an organization to tackle pollution issues, to get people involved in the river.
Restore and preserve.
Yes, to restore and preserve the river. And so we started off, and obviously there was no entity. Yeah. We had to create an organization.
And so on day one, are you looking at restoring and preserving around Atlanta, or are you looking at the Chattahoochee as a whole? I mean, give us a little bit of background on just...
Right. Well, what we know is that the river, of course, is simply the compilation of all the tributaries that run into it.
Yes.
In the watershed or river basin.
Starting up at Jack's Knob, kind of in North Georgia?
Starting a little bit, exactly, above Helen, and so in North Georgia. And so it's the land area that drains into the Chattahoochee that we have to protect and be careful of what we're putting into these creeks, because it's going to flow into the river. And so when we started, we tackled the upper half of the river basin from the mountains to West Point Lake. And then about a dozen years ago, we extended our reach down to the Florida line.
Yeah.
It's a big area, nearly 9,000 square miles.
I want to get into just how the Chattahoochee, it's so uniquely Georgia, right? And yes, the Alabama-Georgia line, and then ends in the Georgia-Florida line. And I want to get to how several sides of Georgia have probably come together to ensure that it's safe and clean. But in the first couple years, talk to us about what were some of the first steps you did to preserve and restore. I mean, was it like, okay, it's coming through the city of Atlanta, it's getting dirty, now we've got to, clean it, or?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different ways to go about cleaning up and then protecting a river. And what we knew back in 93, 94 was that there were many sources of pollution in this urban area where we now have 5 million people dependent on the Chattahoochee River. But the biggest threat that had been going on for decades, and government had done nothing about it, was the fact that the city of Atlanta sewers were routinely discharging untreated sewage into the creeks that run through our neighborhoods in the city and directly into the river itself. And no one did anything about it, even though the Federal Clean Water Act, passed in the early 70s, said you've got to meet certain standards, treat your sewage, use the river as a place to dispose of your treated sewage, but it has to meet standards.
Sure.
And so you may not remember, but back then, the river, particularly below Peachtree Creek, below Atlanta, heading on down through South Cobb, South Fulton, Carroll County, down to West Point Lake, was septic. I mean, the bacteria was so prevalent. It was a public health issue. It was a hazard. You could go out after a heavy rainstorm and find every single thing you put into your toilet on the trees and along the banks. And although the federal government, the EPA, and our state environmental agency had the authority and responsibility to use the law to fix that, they didn't do it.
Right.
So we had to do something about it.
And was that the Riverkeeper plus City of Atlanta? Because I remember Shirley Franklin came in, and she's kind of known as the
sewer mayor.
The sewer mayor.
Yeah. Well, when we ended up before Shirley came in, and she was certainly a major heroine in this story. But we organized a coalition of downstream cities, counties, and property owners. We being the organization is called Chattahoochee Riverkeeper. It's a little confusing. I also had the title of executive director and Riverkeeper. So the organization itself, which was at the time rather small, but had a very strong board, reached out to then Mayor Bill Campbell. Didn't hear back. Reached out to the EPA in the state and didn't hear back. So our coalition filed a lawsuit in October of 1995 in federal court and basically said, we have the evidence, the data that shows the City of Atlanta is not meeting the requirements of the Clean Water Act, and we will take you to court. The Clean Water Act has a provision that allows citizen groups to do that. So less than a year before the Olympics in the fall of 1995, we went to federal court to clean up the Chattahoochee downstream of Atlanta.
Okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean people getting in there, clearly cleaning out the trash, but like how do you do a Brita filter?
No, yeah, you're right. Well, so let's think about this. When you flush your toilet, where does the waste in the toilet go?
Sewage plant?
It goes to the sewage plant. But if the pipes are broken, it doesn't make it to the sewage plant, right? If the pipes are cracked and old, like they have been in the city, hundreds of years old, stormwater infiltrates, manholes will because of the water pressure, pop open. The raw sewage flows down along the gravity-fed lines, people's yards, that sort of thing. The sewage plants themselves had not been upgraded, so the technology was not there. No one had invested over the years, really since the 1970s, in the infrastructure, in the pipes. So it was getting out where it was harmful to people, wildlife, property values. And so we got before a federal judge. 1997, the judge said, you're right, the City of Atlanta is violating the Clean Water Act. We settled that case in 1998 and 99. At that point, the EPA did come in to be helpful. And it created a giant 250, 300-page consent decree, an agreement over the years how the city would find where its pipes are, find the problems, enlarge them, reroute, upgrade the treatment plants. And it cost $2 billion.
Yes.
Which is why our water and sewer rates went up a bit. But the negligence of decades, the refusal of elected officials over many generations, but decades, had resulted in this problem. It's like if you left the plumbing in your house leaking and broken, and then when you finally have to fix it, it's going to cost a lot. But the result has been amazing.
So the timing for Mayor Shirley Franklin to pick up that cause was pretty good.
It was. She came in, she knew she had to do it, but she knew she wanted to do it. Yeah. She came in early 2002 for her 8 years. She was incredibly important because although we'd won in federal court and we had this mandate,
still have to do
Somebody
it.
we had to do it. We had to implement it. We had to find the money.
Right.
And we had to, and she was brilliant in that she not only said, I'm going to fix the sewer pipes, I'm going to bring in the drinking water pipes too. They're also hundreds of years old and decrepit. You can't run a city, a prosperous growing city like Atlanta, without having infrastructure in there. And so she took on the city council. We both worked actively in the media and with other state officials. And I'm happy to say that today, in 2023, every single bit hasn't been finished, but $2 billion has been spent, and the river below Atlanta is dramatically cleaner, not just for the critters, which is important,
Right.
but the fact is that we have seen also that the improved infrastructure in the city, according to Shirley Franklin, has allowed $18 billion in new investment that wouldn't have happened if you can't get clean drinking water to people and take away the waste.
Right.
Also, you probably know about Riverlands, which is a fantastic trail, 100-mile multimodal trail proposed by Trust for Public Lands and others from Buford Dam down below the city.
Yep.
This wouldn't have happened if everything that you see in the toilet was still floating past. Property values have increased, commercial development.
And clearly it's always a work in progress. What were the first 5 years like of actual, going from destitute to not sparkling clean, but the transition that occurred?
Well, the transition certainly took more than 5 years for the city of Atlanta to raise the money and to begin. If you think about a $2 billion project, that's a lot of effort.
That's a lot.
And so one of the things I talk about, certainly in the book I've written, is that it takes stick-to-itiveness. It takes dogged persistence, using the power of the law and a community of support to make things happen. Mm-hmm. And the city's pollution is not the only pollution of the river.
Right.
We've got storm runoff. Huge problem now with climate change intensifying. So you got to fix the pipes, not just with the city, but with Fulton County, with all the other local governments.
And I saw that there were 6 kind of pillars, right? Whether it's legislative, river cleanup.
Yes.
There are a few more. Which one's the most biggest priority right now?
Well, I would say that Riverkeeper's work today, and I've been retired now 9 years.
Yeah. Still senior advisor.
Yeah,
right?
senior advisor. And the young man, Jason Ulseth, who is now the Riverkeeper and director, is doing a phenomenal job. What we see and what I worry about, couple things. Climate change, certainly. Stormwater runoff and flooding. I worry about the heat issue being in the South. But related to water, did you notice 2 months ago the rain bomb that went off in downtown Atlanta?
How the entire streets were flooded?
Seriously flooded. We've never seen anything quite like this before. Nearly 2 inches of rain in 15 minutes. We're going to see more things like this. We've got to be better prepared in the city and in the metro region to manage intense storms that are coming and droughts that will also be intermittent.
That was wild because I remember seeing photos online of cars being flooded, and I'm like, that rain just popped up out of nowhere.
Well, but it was, an isolated little event, but these are happening more and more. And when it happens over an area like downtown Atlanta, which is virtually all hard pavement rooftops,
right?
Where does the water go? And it flooded into the dorms at Clark Atlanta. Cars were swept away.
That's right.
Atlanta has not yet really grappled with stormwater in a way that it needs to. And Shirley and I both have talked about this is one thing. As we were working on sewers, there wasn't the momentum or political will to pass a stormwater utility.
Right.
And we're going to see this, we hope, in the new year. It's a way to raise revenue to deal with the volume of water.
Yep.
And it's polluted. It's running off the streets. It's running off yards. And so that's a critical issue today. We've also got these things that are emerging, PFAS, the forever chemicals. We've got microplastics in the water. We've got, again, with climate change, the possibility of toxic green algae in areas where there's a lot of phosphorus, and because of drought, we will have lower water levels. Not to be doom and gloom, we've done a lot in 3 decades.
Yes,
but the work isn't totally done.
I read your Atlanta article, and I'd love to just learn some of the secrets that of your favorite spots all across the width of, or the length of the Chattahoochee, whether it's North Georgia. So a couple most overrated part of the Chattahoochee.
No part's overrated. No part is overrated. It is all fantastic. And the exciting thing is there was 70 miles of river below Atlanta that was off limits and invisible until we've cleaned it up. And now it's potential for recreation, for careful development. I have several places down that I love, the islands down near McIntosh Reserve in Carroll County, on down. I love paddling down through Bushhead Shoals and Daniel Shoals. These are places that people don't know much about. But now they're businesses, they're outfitters that are helping put people on the river that for so long was off limits.
So that would be the most underrated.
In the past, underrated, yes, but that's true. That's in the past underrated by the general public.
Yes.
But not by those in the know.
Yep.
Luckily, more people are learning about the river. And of course, we have a fabulous national park from Buford Dam down to Peachtree Creek, 48 miles, passed into law by Jimmy Carter in 1978. So we do have a recreational resource that also has development squeezing in on it, on all those streams flowing into the river, where you get erosion and things like that. So, in my mind, and I see places up in the headwaters that I love too. So there's something special everywhere.
This podcast is brought to you by Atlanta Ventures. Check out our website to access many resources, including free tools and guides to start a business, a calendar of our upcoming events hosted at Atlanta Tech Village, and a lot more content around building companies. Let's talk about some of the development, right? I've been to the Chattahoochee coffee shop, right across from East Palisades, and it is one of my favorite coffee shops in Atlanta. It is,
and it's sort of a secret. It's a little bit tricky to get into, but I think it has one of the best views of the river.
Really,
in Atlanta,
looking
downstream.
Oh yeah, and there's something calming. People say Atlanta doesn't have an ocean, we're landlocked, but if you want to hear water, you can hear water. And I like going there and actually hearing the water from the Chattahoochee while, whether I'm reading or on the laptop.
There's something absolutely magical about the sound of water, about being close to flowing water.
Yes. And
it's actually, there's a scientific reason. It's called negative ions. The air particles, when there's sunshine, for instance, or waves, that sort of thing, air particles will break apart, and these negative ions we breathe them in, and it is it's a chemical reaction. We feel better. It's more soothing. We feel more relaxed. And so that's what I did for over a year. I walked in retirement down to the Chattahoochee River, along a creek, listening to that music, and then to the water, to the river, and I wrote about it.
That's beautiful. I want to get to your book because I know writing is it's in the genes.
That's true.
Before we get there, tell us a little bit more about just how do you have smart construction on the Chattahoochee? Because you look at this coffee shop and it's like, wow, there'd be cool to have a lot more of these. But then you're like, well, you don't really want to develop on the river. And so how does the Riverkeeper perspective.
Well, right. Well, we do interact with local land use and zoning decisions from time to time because development of the last century basically paved over, cut down the vegetation next to the waterways. And it's not just the river. Remember, it's the tributaries too, because if they're not protected, the river will be polluted. There's something called low impact development. It's use of pervious material, for instance, in parking lots, leaving the vegetated buffer along the river. You'll notice that Chattahoochee Coffee Shop is back from the river. It's built back. And that's really important. There's a state law passed 50 years ago that helps protect the corridor along the main stem of the river. A group called Friends of the River got it passed, and it has helped guide development away from floodplains, wetlands, and steep slopes. Mm-hmm. It's all, how you place development on the land, and then how during construction you make sure when it rains that the runoff doesn't head down, because you're just sending a problem downstream to somebody else.
Right.
Muddy water, polluted water, and it's not legal, and I'd say it's not moral.
Yeah. And so let's also talk about the genesis of this memoir, right? Have you been journaling for years, and this was
I wish.
and this was a composite of it, or first of all, writing a book, the time, effort, energy. Tell us what inspired you to do it.
Yeah. Well, people used to say, well, when are you going to write a book? And I'd be like, I don't have the time, and I can't remember.
Keeping the Chattahoochee.
Yeah. It's titled Keeping the Chattahoochee, Reviving and Defending a Great Southern River. Mm. I didn't plan to write it. I really didn't. I didn't sit down and say, I'm going to write a book and I'll be done in a year or 2 years. I had retired 9 years ago from Chattahoochee Riverkeeper, and I taught a class at Georgia Tech. I really enjoyed engaging with younger graduate students. And
one of your alma maters?
Yes, that's true. And then I read a book that inspired me about someone who went into a forest every week over a year, a brilliant writer and scientist named David Haskell, who teaches at Sewanee. And that inspired me. I thought, I have the time in retirement. I want to unlearn hurrying, which I've done all my life, is hurry from place to place, mothering and river keeping. I want to slow down. I want to teach myself to go slower. I want to be more attentive and really absorb nature and learn. And so I did that starting in May 2019, and I did then start journaling about what I was seeing. And I noticed things in all my hiking and paddling in my life I had never really looked at before. Looking at closely trees and through the seasons, the floor of the forest, the water, how it changes over time. Certainly, I'd noticed these things in a general way, but not in a way that brought back home to me the kinship we have with all living things on this planet, and particularly with this river. And every time I would take a walk, I'd have a memory of something that occurred during my river keeping years. And I thought, well, maybe there's a book here. Maybe each chapter will be a walk at the river in the present tense, and then I'll remember something that happened to illustrate how we work to save the river. Successes, failures, funny things, alarming, some of the people we dealt with and companies along the way that weren't so fun, and government agencies. And then COVID hit, and the pandemic. And as an elderly person sheltering at home, I had all this time.
Right.
So I wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I rewrote, because I'm not a trained writer. I do write a little column for Rough Draft Atlanta, Intown.
Keith Pepper.
Every month, which I enjoy. I've done that for 8 years. It's called Above the Waterline. But I had a lot to learn about writing, and the intent is for a general reader. Early reviewers said, you're writing this like it's for your peers, and then we did this, and then we did that. So I had to rethink, how do I put into words that resonate with a more general audience, what I feel when I'm at the river, when I'm in a forest, and how that can motivate you to action and how it did for the 20 years that I served as the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper.
Well,
it was immensely satisfying, the book.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I hope you put your son who writes for the New Yorker to some of his editing tasks.
Well, actually, I talked to both my boys about the book. My younger son, who's an educator and is also a wordsmith, I'm teaching English here locally, but they helped me rethink some things. My older son, who is a journalist for the New Yorker, looked at a chapter or two and sat me down and explained a few things that sort of themes and ways I might look about expressing what I was trying to say. Mm-hmm. And I took what he said and I went through the rest of the book with his words in my head. And
wow.
I think I made it better. For one thing, he definitely said, cut these really long sentences, Mom. You can have some, but this is too much. You're trying to tell too much.
And so what do you want people to take away from the book?
Well, really, I wrote it for two purposes as it ultimately evolved. One, I hope to inspire people to take the time to have an experience like I did and try to continue by finding a place, whether it's your own backyard or a trail at the river or a forest in the mountains, and visit it regularly. We all are so destination oriented. I want to go here, and I need to go fast. And how can a 5-mile hike? And you're hiking along. Take the time to look around you, feel, smell, and listen. It is so terrific for our well-being to be connected to nature in a way that is visceral like that. And it's so fun to learn about the different trees and what the blessing we have in Georgia of our waterways and our diversity in this state. So that's the first thing I would love if somebody, readers, are inspired to do something like I did. And secondly, for people inclined to safeguard our environment, again, whether it be a city park or a river, forest, I hope that maybe my stories will illustrate some of what it takes to do this work. And particularly for young people to understand, there's a lot can be accomplished good things can be accomplished, I should say, in a short time. But for the really big, hard, controversial things, you've got to have dogged persistence, stick-to-itiveness, and it can take years, whether you stick with it for years or you find other people to carry on what you've been doing. I thought when we started Riverkeeper, 8 years we'd be, finished with a lot of things.
Right.
Well, no.
I was going to say, how did you know, coming up on our 30th, on the 30th, how did you know the job was done?
Well, it's
never done.
Not done. A couple things. I knew that it was time for me to move on because I had these two fantastic people to take over. One is the Riverkeeper, one is the executive director. They'd been with me. I'd hired them, and they'd been with me for a number of years. And they were clearly ready for leadership. I like the idea of leaving at the 20th anniversary. We'd have a big celebration. We'd celebrate 2 decades of getting a lot done. Not everything, but a lot. And we would celebration is really key to this work because you can always see the things ahead of you that still need to be done. We needed to bring people together and thank them and say goodbye to Sally. Sally moves on to do other things, although staying, as an advisor to the organization. So it was right before my 64th birthday, and I thought this is the time. I will say it was the time, although I still miss some things about it, as well as the things that I don't miss about it. There are those things too.
For those listening that want to get involved, what are ways they can do and get involved?
Yeah. First of all, get to know the river and the watershed. Get out and enjoy it. As writer Ed Abbey said so eloquently, and I won't remember the quote exactly, but he's like, don't just, go to the, don't just fight in the courts, in the classroom, and wherever else for the river. Get out and enjoy the river. Get on it. Get on her, and paddle, walk beside her. And there are a lot of ways to do that through many organizations, including Chattahoochee Riverkeeper. So get a personal connection to the river, and I think that will help motivate action, which trash cleanups are a great thing to get involved with. Chattahoochee Riverkeeper has removed tons and tons of trash over the years, and we love helping people work with us on that. Support, of course, the Riverkeeper organization and other groups that are doing things to protect what you care about most in your community in terms of the environment. And never forget to vote and to learn about some of these issues so that you're a good informed voter, and understand that our state, local state, and federal officials have so much to say about how protected our air, land, and water is. And I served, appointed by Governor Roy Barnes back in the late 90s. I served for 7.5 years on the Georgia Board of Natural Resources and saw up close what goes on with our state officials in terms of taking informed but informed decisions about clean water and clean air, and how much too often dollar signs are attached in a way that doesn't give what I think the people of our community really want to see in terms of protection for their families and for prosperity. So join groups, get out there and vote.
Yep. And then before wrapping up, the Chattahoochee has such a cultural importance. And I don't know if it was the Alan Jackson song, which I'm sure you've probably heard thousands of times.
Love that song.
Yeah, it's great. How does it, the cultural influence of the Chattahoochee, how does it bring Georgia together, right? Because, you've got people in the city that care about it, and you've got people in South Georgia that care about it. What did you see how the Chattahoochee brought?
And that is such a good question because, most of us humans think about the part of the river we see and where we are and fail to realize that this amazing liquid lifeline runs through communities from the mountains all the way to the sea, and that all along the way, people and wildlife need the river, need to take care of the river and use it reasonably. And so a lot of our efforts have pertained to making those connections between Lake Lanier, Atlanta, West Point Lake, Columbus, and on down to Apalachicola Bay, and realizing that we're all a family that enjoys the bounty of this resource, and that we've got to focus on, yes, satisfying needs, but not greeds. We've got to look at preserving this river basin for posterity. And so we worked hard to try to make those connections.
And was it more political, or was it cleanup?
Through political, through films, through books, through back in the day slideshows. In fact, there's going to be a film coming out here in the next couple of months about women who work to defend the Chattahoochee River. It's called Saving the Chattahoochee by a local filmmaker, Hal Jacobs. People connect with a resource like a river in different ways. And so the more you tell stories about people who paddle the length of the river, what they see along the way, what they experience, then perhaps we'll find it in ourselves to share her a little better.
We always wrap up the conversation of why Atlanta and what has Atlanta done for you. As someone who's lived in the city for probably since your Georgia Tech years.
Actually, since I was at the mid-1950s, since I was a little toddler.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm an Atlantan inside the perimeter the whole time.
Wow. So I guess why is because born and raised, right?
Well, for sure raised, absolutely. And I've been lucky to have parents who cared about the environment. And I grew up on a little stream not far from here, a tributary to Nancy Creek, Peachtree Creek, and then the Chattahoochee. I fell asleep every night listening to the flow of water there. I think I've always had just a physical connection to the waterways, the beauty, the forests of the city. And I've been lucky. I've stayed mostly in the same place most of my life, but it's meant that I've been able to network with a lot of different kind of people and help find ways to connect people on issues. And that's what Atlanta's really brought to me.
Sally, thank you so much for being part of the Atlanta Story podcast.
Thank you, Jon. I appreciate it.
This podcast is brought to you by Atlanta Ventures. It was co-produced by JC Cadet and Jon Birdsong. If you are looking to start the next $300 million business in Atlanta, check out the studio at atlantaventures.com and the companies we work with who've done it before. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it at your next coffee meeting or dinner greeting, rate it, and write a benevolent, eloquent review.